Hello, Ron. It's great to meet you.
Great to meet you too.
Okay, you started Clean Edge in year 2000. Can you please explain Clean Edge and what was the impetus for starting Clean Edge 23 years ago before many people were even thinking about clean energy and broader clean technologies?
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me. It's great to be here. And I got to meet some of your colleagues when I was in Tokyo, so it's good to be back talking with you all. First, let me just talk about the impetus. I was a child of the 70s and 80s. I spent most of my childhood summers in Algonquin Park in Northern Ontario. And there was a huge impact that I had at about the age of 9 or 10. I was told I could no longer drink the water directly from the lake. And I
Mm,
understand that drinking water directly from a lake was kind of an incredibly precious thing. Like that doesn't happen in many places. The water is very clean in Northern Ontario, but we were told we couldn't drink the water because of acid rain. And so that had a huge impact on me. And then when I was in university, I really, really wanted to see how I could be involved in the clean energy sector. And in fact, I did a study abroad at Konen Daigaku in Kobe.
mm.
And when I lived in Japan, had this real sense of, and I came back later, which we can talk about, but I got this real sense of how the Japanese were actually technologically thinking about eco society and this type of development. And those two things really got me focused on thinking about working in the clean energy sector. Now, I went through three technology waves. First, telecommunications in Asia, then the internet, and then finally clean tech. But
Mm.
around the time of 2000, 1999, I was doing a lot of internet work, and I realized that a lot of my clients were now clean energy related. And so I realized that finally the time had come. And so I went to a conference in Geneva that was put on by the World Bank and some other folks, sort of quasi-governmental organizations. And from that trip on the plane ride back, I came up with the concept for an analyst consulting firm focused on clean tech. Got in touch with Joel McCower, who was running Green Biz and still does, is still involved, and told him my idea, and we formed Clean Edge 6 months later. So that was sort
Mm.
of the impetus. And then in terms of what we did for quite a few years, we were putting on big conferences. So we were convening people. We were publishing reports and books. We were consulting to government organizations, to corporates, to investment firms. And of course, we got involved in the stock indexing realm, which I'm happy to talk about.
Sounds good. Now, let me start with the basic question. For the benefit of our audience, can you please explain what clean technologies are? And can you also discuss the evolution of clean technologies and how they have been evolving?
Sure. It's a great question. So first, what is clean tech? So clean tech includes renewables. So it covers solar and wind and all of the clean energy sectors, but it also covers energy efficiency, next generation grids, electrification of transportation and heating, energy storage, clean water, and waste management. So it's a much broader umbrella than just clean energy. At the core, clean technologies, products, and services reduce negative environmental impacts such as carbon emissions and pollution um, via the use of more efficiency and improvements and also more sustainable energy and material inputs. So some people also, there's another term right now, you might have heard climate tech. Some people call it clean tech, climate tech now. And then earlier people used the term green tech. But that broadly is a much broader definition. And I think it really, they sort of represent the core technologies that we need to ensure that humanity can survive on the planet. So that's sort of in a nutshell how I would define it. In our first book, The Clean Tech Revolution, which I found out, well, it had been translated into Japanese, and I met the translator when I was in Tokyo. But
Mm.
one other thing that we added to that was that clean technologies deliver equal or superior performance compared to conventional offerings. So that doesn't always happen, but you think about like an electric vehicle. Well, electric vehicles actually give you more power. They have less need for constant maintenance. You don't have to input any fossil fuels or oil changes. So often there are benefits beyond just cost savings or replacement of energy source. It gives you other benefits. So that's sort of what we're seeing. I think you also asked sort of the evolution. Is that right? The evolution of clean technologies.
Yes.
I think the biggest story around the evolution of clean technologies really is price. They've gotten competitive. And because of that, they've become mainstream. And so when we started Clean Edge back in 2000, I actually think the largest solar PV manufacturer on the planet was Sharp. I used to work for Sharp when I was in Osaka and Kobe. And it wasn't a lot of output, but they were the largest. Today we have gigafactories. And so what we've seen are these economies of scale, massive learning curves, more akin to the chip industry than the energy sector. And so now about 82% of all new electricity capacity additions globally last year came from renewables, namely solar and wind. So that's the big difference, is this sort of mainstreaming. If I had told people 20 years ago that solar would be the fastest growing and the biggest contributor to new capacity additions globally, I think they would have had a hard time believing that. But that's where we are today. Another great example would be LEDs. And you know, LEDs, when I started Clean Edge, I think I had to wait like 5 years, about 5 years into Clean Edge in 2005, where I was able to buy a $10 or $15 LED bulb, and I was ecstatic. Now it's the only bulbs you can get. So again, a mainstreaming. And out of Japan, I think heat pumps are a great example. I saw my first heat pump or mini split inverter in Japan probably 30 years ago. Now that's what you put in the US. So these are the shifts, and it's really the mainstreaming of the technologies that's really the big development.
You kind of answered my next question, but I ask you anyway. The book you wrote, the Clean Tech Revolutions, I believe that was published 16 years ago.
Correct.
You wrote about 8 emerging clean tech opportunities. That's including solar, wind, green buildings, and water filtration, and 21st century smart grid. Of these 8 themes, can you please highlight and discuss few themes that have impacted us most, changed our world most in this past 16 years, and give us a few examples, please?
Absolutely. So first of all, absolutely solar and wind. And solar and wind, as I said, have gone. A great example is the United States. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, about 75% of new capacity additions added in the US. This is actual additions onto the grid. Big numbers, lots of new electricity generation plants. 75% were natural gas or fossil fuels. There was even coal. Today, 75% comes from solar and wind. So that's the biggest shift for sure. And I think one of the trends that we had outlined and has had the greatest impact in the intervening 16 years. I think part of what I was saying earlier were these trends were really involved to, let's talk about the chip industry real quick. If you think about Moore's law, you had this law that basically said for every doubling of output every year and a half, you're going to see half the cost and more storage capacity on the chip, right? Like this is a law, it just happened again and just continued. You don't see that traditionally in the energy sector, but in solar and wind, especially, and energy storage, you do. So solar has its own Moore's law. It's a learning curve. For every doubling of manufacturing output globally, the cost of a solar PV cell declines by 20%. So that's really these economies of scale that I think were so important, and is really, we're seeing that now with energy storage. And I think you're asking like what's sort of really occurred during the time we wrote the book, and now energy storage and the grid are the 2 other great enablers. So solar and wind have come down dramatically in cost. So now they're competitive. That's the majority of new electricity going online. You need energy storage to store those electricity because solar only produces when the sun is shining, and wind when the wind is blowing. And so you need storage capacity. And then you need a modern 21st century grid. These are all themes, obviously, that we look at very closely. And those have all stood the test of time from when we wrote the book 16 years ago. I would say you asked like some other things that maybe changed. There is an example of stuff that didn't work that we maybe highlighted. And I think we thought that they would, but we had questions. And I think biofuels is a great example. The issue with the biofuel sector was that we were trying to take virgin crops and turn them into fuel. And if you take corn and now you're competing with food, that's not a really good idea. And that became very problematic. And the question of how much carbon reduction were you really getting out of those biofuels? So now the only thing we really track within the biofuel sector are what we say waste to resource. So how do you take a waste stream and turn that into an energy source? And a great example, I don't know if you are familiar with RNG or renewable natural gas, but this is becoming quite a big business where you take the emission, you take the methanol coming off, or the methane, excuse me, coming off of cow manure as an example. You capture it, you turn it into pipeline-ready natural gas. These are the type of biofuels that we're really seeing more traction with. But if you were taking corn, which was maybe could have been used for food, that didn't really prove to be a very successful outcome, and definitely a change from our view 16 years ago.
Of these examples you gave us now, which technologies are farther out or less likely to gain significant momentum in the next 10 years?
Right. So there are some examples of things that maybe look more like biofuels or ethanol biofuel. Not that it isn't happening. It's just not really addressing the issue that clean tech is supposed to address. So we have a thing called the Clean Edge Tech Maturation Model. It's on our website. So if people go to cleanedge.com, they can go to data dives and can find the Clean Edge Tech Maturation Model. The reason I'm directing you to that is because it basically plots two different things on the XY axis. It looks at cost competitiveness. Is the technology cost competitive today, or is it, more like 10 years out? And then we look at technological development. Is it mass market availability today? Is it emerging, or is it pre-commercial? And so when you look in the upper right corner, that's where we put all the mature technologies. You've got things like LED, utility scale solar, utility scale onshore wind, smart meters, quite a few companies in Japan involved in smart metering. You've got the 100 to 300 mile range EV. You have electric heat pumps. You've got all of that kind of coming together. That's solid today and available. If you go in the middle range, there's a lot of various technologies. You plot more than 30 technologies. But let me go to the bottom left corner, that quadrant. What do you got there? Fusion power. SMRs. I don't know if you know what SMR, that's small modular nuclear reactors. All electric, zero emissions, long haul air travel. These are much further out. And even though we have them down in that corner, they could be 10 years away. They could be 30 years away. Those technologies are much further out. And so I think sometimes people say we should do an all of the above approach. I think right now we have certain technologies that are ready to go, other technologies that are quite uncertain. So I tend to look at the stuff that's available now or 2 to 5 years out. And certainly, since we deal with publicly traded companies, we're dealing mostly with stuff that's in the near to midterm.
You envisioned these themes 16 years ago. Are there any new opportunities that you would add now that you didn't include then?
It's a great question. And I think there's a number of answers. There's certainly new technologies coming out. So I'll talk about those in a second. But really what we've noticed, the biggest change or shift, is that we've gone from technologies sitting in silos to technologies integrating or mashing up, coming together. So that's the big change. And I think if you look at, because I worked, as I said, in telecom and then internet. Well, what happened in telecom? What happened in the internet? It was the systems integration, right? Like that was where all this magic happened, right? Where you take routers and you take data centers and you take telecom and you bring it all together. Then you've got the internet. So I think similarly to clean tech, the biggest developments we'll probably see in the next 3 to 10 years are these mashups or these confluence or integration. So give you an example. Okay, a solar, utility scale solar plant plus storage plus a high voltage direct current transmission line. Now you got 3 technologies coming together to move massive amounts of renewable energy into population centers. Another example would be electric vehicles, what I'm going to call bidirectional grids, not a grid that only lets me receive electricity, but lets me send electricity back to the utility, and aggregated demand response. So now the utility can say to me, everybody's turning on their air conditioners. We see that you're home, Ron. We know you have your EV all charged up. Give us some of those electrons. And that is actually coming to fruition. There are people who were thinking about 15, 20 years ago. It didn't happen. Obviously, it couldn't have. We didn't have the technologies. But now we have bidirectional grid technologies that are starting to be deployed. We have OEMs working with the utilities to say, yeah, let's figure out how to use a demand response model. And things have advanced quite a bit. The other one would be, another example, this is a little further out, would be wind turbines offshore using stationary or floating platforms to generate and produce through electrolysis green hydrogen. Again, another mashup. So I think that's where we're going to see the most activity, these integrations. A couple other things though. I think material science is where we're going to see probably the next great wave of innovation. And so think about energy storage. Well, clearly we've gone down a lithium ion pathway. Well, sodium ion is getting very popular right now. Sodium is very massively available, more than lithium. Even right now, a number of car manufacturers are looking at sodium ion for a passenger vehicle. There's solid state batteries, there's flow batteries. These are material science questions. Semiconductor advancements in inverter controls for solar, in power conversion, advanced membranes for water filtration, carbon nanotubes, things like that. I think there are a number of very advanced nations and corporations that can pull this off. One other thing I would say is we have a shortage of rare earth metals. What if you don't need all those rare earth metals and you find alternatives? I actually think Japanese and US labs are in good positions for some of these breakthroughs coming out of our major universities and other labs. So that to me would be where I would expect a lot. Finally, because I've covered a lot of ground here, I understand, would be electrification. We're already seeing that happen with storage and EVs. We're seeing it with heating in homes, with heat pumps. The next great area will be tackling and decarbonizing very hard to decarbonize sectors like heavy industry. And a great example, which we're seeing right now, is green steel. How do you manufacture a green steel product? And so there are a number of different ways you could get there through green hydrogen or all electric arc furnaces. But that's going to be another big breakthrough area that we don't really have today.
Japanese auto manufacturers have been very focused on fuel cell vehicles or FCVs, but lithium-ion battery packs have been the clear leader for passenger vehicles. What is your views on FCV versus EV dynamic, and will it be possible for the Japanese firms to gain EV market dominance?
Well, dominance will be an interesting question, but let's first look at the dynamics here. I've been very vocal about this for more than a decade. I think anyone listening to Elon Musk, he's been very vocal about this to the Japanese manufacturers. I mean, look, he worked closely with Panasonic, so he understands Japanese brands and has worked closely with them. It is amazing to me, and I'm not denigrating anyone, but it is rather astounding that the Japanese don't actually own this space, right? I mean, Toyota had the first hybrids. Panasonic built the batteries for the first Teslas. So it's not like the Japanese weren't involved. It's just that I think that the Japanese government and the corporations became singularly focused on fuel cell vehicles. And I want to go back to the late 1980s, just because I lived in Japan in the late 80s. As I said, I was in telecom at the time. And the vision, I don't know if you remember this, Hutch, but the vision for Japan was broadband. That was the vision for the country. We are going to be a broadband leader. Well, what happened? I picked up a book out of the United States from George Gilder, all about everything going to fiber optics and digitizing and being completely the opposite of a broadband model. Complete. So what happened? The Japanese were totally focused on broadband, but then everything played out of Silicon Valley, and we saw what happened. The internet got created. So I think, unfortunately, there were probably some industrial policy drivers to focus on FCVs. I do not see an FCV future for passenger vehicles. It's not likely to happen. I think the Japanese are now starting to see that. So the question is, what do you do moving forward? I mean, look, the Chinese and the US, ergo Tesla, have been in the lead, right? Those are the leaders right now. So GM and Ford and Chrysler are all trying to catch up, and so are all the Japanese manufacturers. I mean, the Nissan Leaf was one of the first EVs as well. So I don't think there isn't a pathway for EV leadership for the Japanese. I certainly think dominance at this point is out of the question because it's already being dominated elsewhere. The question is, what can the Japanese do? So how do they line up adequate supply of lithium and other critical materials that are needed to build these plants and build these vehicles? What are the opportunities for Japanese to innovate and perhaps go right to a solid state type technology? I think Toyota is certainly looking at that. We'll see if they can pull it off in the timeframes they're talking about. But yeah, they can still participate, but they're definitely going to have to play catch up.
Now, you're partner with the NASDAQ on 6 indices. How did Clean Edge get into stock indices?
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting story. When we started Clean Edge, we got 5 different trademark classifications, and we actually have them now all in Japan. The classifications were what you would expect from a consultancy. So we had things like research and publications, educational services like conferences and events, consulting, with all the usual suspects. But we also had, and I think I wrote it down, providing investment and financial information relating to companies, technologies, and geographic regions. So even back in 2000, we were already thinking about how would we provide financial information about the companies that were participating. Now, we also were very involved in benchmarking, and you probably don't know this, but we actually benchmarked all 50 states and the top 50 metro regions, and we did a very intricate benchmarking leaderboard for that. We benchmark technologies all the time, and then we thought, well, let's start benchmarking publicly traded equities. And so in 2005, I brought on a Yale MBA student, Nick Broad. He's now a leader in the clean tech sector. He worked with me directly on creating our first stock index, tracking US listed clean energy companies. We then went out to look for people to take the universe that we had created, finalize the index, and take it live, because our expertise is on the thematic universe research and on the definitions, like what is clean energy, like what actually makes it into the universe. And we were very close with a number of other folks, and then ended up a number of very fortuitous events that we got connected with NASDAQ. And the Clean Edge breadth and depth of knowledge on clean tech, and at the time, NASDAQ just building out their very broad indexing capacities. You have to realize these aren't just NASDAQ traded companies. These are globally listed companies. So NASDAQ has a dedicated indexing business. We got together in 2006. We launched our first index, and now we have 6. So it was quite an honor to connect with them. And we've built a really a very strong group of indexes. And so let me just give you an example of the 6 indexes, a few of them. One is the NASDAQ Clean Edge Green Energy Index. That's our first index, and it tracks US listed clean energy companies. The NASDAQ OMX Clean Edge Smart Grid Infrastructure, the only index on the planet tracking the broader grid sector, and smart grid, Q-Grid, and the ISE Clean Edge Global Wind Energy Index, GWE, and the Clean Edge ISE Clean Edge Water Index, HHO. So those are some of the indexes.
So now, can you please explain to us how our viewers can invest in these themes?
Yeah, so obviously individuals cannot invest directly in our indexes. These are at their core benchmarking indexes to provide investors with a transparent access to market trends. And so they can also see it as a performance barometer. So that's the indexing side. There are exchange traded funds based on some of our indexes. And in Europe, there are some UCITS, and in Israel, that we license the indexes across the planet. But in the US, there are 4 ETFs based on the indexes I just mentioned by First Trust. They're QClean, Grid, FAN, and FIW, respectively, from the ones I just mentioned. And all tracking financial products for NASDAQ Clean Edge indexes currently exceed 3 billion assets under management globally as of yesterday, November 27th in the US.
How long do you think these clean tech investment themes are valid? Are we talking 10 years or 20 or 50 years? Can you please give us some sense as to how long one should invest in these themes?
Again, I don't give investment advice, but from a benchmarking perspective, clean tech by its very nature is a very long-term trend. And if you think about the shifts that we've already seen just in the energy realm from, let's say from burning wood to coal, then coal to oil, then oil to gas. Now, they don't always work out that way. Some of them continue to exist, but that's sort of been the historical transition. And if you notice, each time you're going to a lighter carbon footprint, and now we're going from natural gas, of course, and oil to clean energy. Each of those were multi-decade long events in the 50-year range, 30 to 70, very long term. So I'm going to say to you, I believe that 2000, when we started Clean Edge, that's the beginning of the modern energy transition. And the reason I'm going to say that is because it's not like I didn't want to get involved in clean energy in the 1980s or the 1990s. I did. I was just pragmatic and I needed to have a job. And so I went through telecom and the internet. By 1999, when I looked at my client roster and I see the Global Environment Fund and the Rockefeller Fund and all these other organizations and a Ted Turner-backed venture, then I said, oh, now it's shifting. And then I went out and looked, oh, there are venture capitalists. They're setting up funds that are dedicated to this sector. And so I think 2000 represents the beginning of the modern energy transition. And I clearly, strictly, definitely believe that it's at least a 50-year cycle. We've always said that. So we're about halfway through the modern energy transition. We still have many decades left. And some of the harder to decarbonize stuff like big industry and shipping and air travel could take a bit longer. But I think, let's look at most of the zero. A lot of countries are going to meet in Dubai very soon, in a few days. So most of the net zero carbon targets for corporations and for governments are in the 2050 range. Some are earlier. But so yeah, 2050 started at 2000. It's about a 50-year cycle. So yeah, we're deep into this, but we've got a long ways to go, as you know. We're not there yet. So I'll say one last thing. When I was first starting Clean Edge, I would, especially when the book came out 4 years later, I have a lot of conversations with young people. I mean, was young myself at the time, but even younger people. And I'd say, like, look, what are you thinking about doing for your career? And they're like, yeah, I'm interested in clean tech. Well, is it going to be around? I'm like, yeah, this is lifetime employment. So yeah, these are long cycles.
So do you think these clean technology themes can outperform benchmark indices like S&P 500 over long term?
Yeah. So again, I can really only look at the past. I think in terms of the S&P 500, if you're going to use that as a benchmark, it's interesting to sort of look at the past 5 years between 2018 and 2022 on a total return basis. Q-Grid, which is really an infrastructure play because it's all about the grid infrastructure, outperformed the S&P 500 4 out of 5 years. So that's pretty good track record on that end. CLS, which is our US listed clean energy index, you have to remember it really it popped in 2020. It was the highest performing index of any index in NASDAQ's portfolio globally. It was up 185% in 2020. Clearly, it's come back down since then. So in that 5-year period, it outperformed the S&P 500 2 out of 5 years. What I think might be interesting, if you don't mind me sort of bringing up a different comp for cells, would be looking at US listed clean energy against US listed Energy Select, where cells has beaten Energy Select, again, total return, 7 out of the past 10 years. Now, the last few years, Energy Select has been very strong. And I believe that our planet relies on us transitioning to clean energy. We can all debate that if we want to. That's not really debatable for me. So I think those trends are very likely to be that we're going to see a lot more activity on the clean energy front, on the grid front, on the water front. One thing that I would add to all of this, and we've already seen it play out, as clean tech matures and the energy transition intensifies, we're seeing much greater convergence between our benchmarks and benchmarks like the S&P 500. So current companies that are in our index cells and also in the S&P 500, and they weren't there, just a few years ago, are Tesla, Enphase Energy, First Solar, SolarEdge, and Albemarle. So these become more mainstay. They become larger companies, and they move into the S&P 500. So there'll be less differentiation over time. But clearly, these are thematics.
Mm-hmm. Now, finally, what would you say are the risks of clean tech investment themes, if any?
Well, there are, of course. And I'm going to look at it more from headwinds, sort of more through a policy, technology, capital lens, rather than through just an investment lens. Because we do think, as we're defining it, we're looking at technology innovation, policy, and capital innovation. So what are the challenges? Well, you can guess a few of them. And even if you don't follow the sector closely, I'm assuming you would know some of these just because they've been in the news. So the very first one is the high interest rates, which have really impacted so many industries. And if you think about clean technology, most all of the costs are up front. Like you put in the solar plant, you don't have the costs for the fuel because the sun is free. You don't have the costs for the wind, but you have the upfront capital costs. So if you see interest rates double, that causes some pain. Now, I think we've gotten near the end of, I think we all know this, we can see we're hitting the peak of interest rates. They're going to start to come back down, most likely. We'll get to more normalcy, but that definitely had a huge impact over the last 2 years. Increase of cost of capital. Material supply constraints still loom large. Is there enough lithium ion? Is there enough nickel that's readily available? So those type of things. Another big one, definitely globally, certainly in the US, where we look at very closely, are transmission bottlenecks. So you may have all of that clean energy being generated, but can you get it onto the grid? And so the transmission, we need to build a 21st century grid. Money is going towards that. We're seeing it happen. I want to add something here. These are the headwinds, but just so you know, more money for the last 4 years each year has been invested in the clean energy transition sectors than in fossil fuels globally, based on Bloomberg NEF data, New Energy Finance. So we are seeing the monies come in, but transmission bottlenecks, there's other ones. I think some safety concerns with lithium ion battery packs. You need to make sure that they are contained and they don't have thermal runaway. NIMBY, are you familiar with NIMBY means? Yeah, so in the US, it means not in my backyard. So they'll all day long, someone will say, oh, I want wind, I want solar. Not in my backyard. So that has been another headwind. I think it's very surmountable. Look, more solar will be deployed in the US this year than ever before. In Texas, in California, in red states, in blue states. Let me wrap up. I think you asked me the last question. Even against these challenges, I believe this shift is pretty much incontrovertible. It's moving forward. So let me give China as an example. They absolutely continue to build coal plants. There's no doubt they have. They've built coal plants, way too many. They keep building, but they also lead in clean technology sectors. So the latest reports are showing that China could actually reach peak emissions next year. That would be the year at which they hit their most amount of emissions that they're ever going to record, and they're going to start to decline from there. They were targeting 2030. Well, how the heck are they getting there? Like, let's see if that plays out next year. It could be the year after or the year after that. It's coming soon. But what did they do? Well, China globally is the #1 producer and deployer of electric vehicles. Last year, 1 out of every 3 cars pretty much was an EV. Energy storage, batteries, they go together with EVs. Electrolyzers, which help you convert water to hydrogen from using usually renewable electricity. Solar, wind, and heat pumps. These are all the technologies of the future. China mapped it out in their 5-year plans for the last 20 plus years. And I think that we're going to see, even with all these headwinds, that the shift is occurring quite rapidly. We are witnessing that in real time.
Well, Ron, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us today. Hope to speak with you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Hope to meet you next time I'm in Japan. Thank you.